The Cow Who Climbed a Tree by Gemma Marino. To my parents, who never told me my dreams were nonsense. Tina was a very curious cow. She had a thirst for discovery. Her mind was full of wonderful things, all of which her sisters found very silly. Impossible, ridiculous, nonsense, they would say every time she told them her amazing ideas. Her sisters were only interested in one thing: fresh and juicy grass. One day, when Tina was exploring the woods, she decided to try something new. She began to climb a tree. Up and up she went. And at the top, Tina couldn't believe her eyes. Unlike the fierce dragon she had seen in her books, this one was friendly and vegetarian. All afternoon, they talked about wonderful dreams and incredible stories.
Wow.
Tina couldn't wait to tell her sisters about her new friend. But her sisters were not impressed. Dragons don't exist. Cows can't climb trees. Impossible, ridiculous, nonsense, they said. And with that, they went to bed. But the next morning, Tina was nowhere to be seen. Her sisters found a note.
Gone flying with the dragon of the woods.
Well, that was it. Tina's nonsense had gone too far. The sisters decided to go and find her and bring her home. For the first time, they ventured beyond the farm and into the woods.
Oh.
They had never imagined it would be so beautiful. And then they came across something very strange. Impossible, they said. But the first cow began to climb, and one after another, up they went. The world beyond the fields was extraordinary.
Wow.
But where was Tina? Suddenly, the cows looked up. It was impossible. It was ridiculous. It was nonsense. But it was true. Tina was flying. And when she asked her sisters to join her, they said something they had never said before. Yes, why not? And after that, they just couldn't wait to see what else was possible.
I was raised by a stay-at-home dad, in a time that stay-at-home dads were definitely unusual. So unusual, in fact, that I have memories in my early elementary years, after my dad had helped with a class party, of another student's mom telling me how sorry she was that I had lost my mom. This confused me and her when I looked at her and explained, my mom wasn't lost. She was just at work. It took me a few more years to understand the assumptions behind her words. The idea that the only way a dad would be a room parent would be if he had lost his wife. My dad was, in fact, not a widower. Being a stay-at-home dad was never in the plan, but my dad got laid off as a welder, and my mom had gotten a job in a STEM field. My younger brother had major disabilities, and they realized very quickly that they would spend more on childcare than my dad could make. Do you remember the early 80s movie, Mr. Mom? Starring Michael Keaton as the dad who is suddenly thrust into a stay-at-home role and chaos ensues? Yeah, that movie became our running family joke. Okay, it wasn't quite that chaotic, but I do clearly remember when the entirety of my dad's cooking repertoire included hot dogs and spaghetti. But what my dad taught me was that to be a dad, to be a man, meant when life happens and plans change, you roll with it. You have to learn to throw away gender roles out the window and be able to learn something new. Every day, he'd be on the phone with his mother-in-law, learning how to cook something new. Years later, when people remarked how lucky I was to have a spouse who changed diapers, I was confused. Wasn't it an expectation? Why would I want to parent with someone who wasn't willing to be an equal partner? And as my son has grown, my spouse and I have continued to be just as dedicated to constantly challenging gender roles in our son's world. Even before he was born, especially as a queer mom and a non-binary dad, we felt committed to gender being a concept our child gets to decide for themselves, both in identity and definition. It's a complex, constant learning curve. But so far, with his love of dresses and superheroes, cars and nail polish, Caleb Starr seems quite comfortable deciding for himself who he is. Summer before last, we were at Lake Farm Parks, playing in the water feature, when an older child looked at my son and asked, "Is he a boy or a girl?" looking at his long hair. I smiled and said, "He's a little boy," as Caleb continued to happily play. The older child brushed back their own long hair and sighed with all of the sage world weariness that a maybe 9-year-old could muster up. "He has the same problem I have. Everyone always thinks that I'm a girl," he exclaimed. And then he paused. "But that's okay. Because my dad always says being called a girl isn't an insult." Not gonna lie, I wanted to find this kid's dad and hug him for doing it right. I worry for the day when my child isn't in such a safe bubble when exploring gender. For the day he goes to school and another child, or even adult, tries to convince him the color pink is for girls, or that he can't love unicorns. But it's moments like this, and kids and communities like our church, that give me hope and faith that he will have enough support to explore who he is or isn't, and feel safe enough to tell us. I'd like to share with you a story that was printed in the UK's Guardian newspaper a few years ago. It was written by Jay Fernandez, a then 23-year-old administrative assistant living in London. I share this not because it represents all transgender folks, but only to share his story. I also don't want to co-opt Jay's voice. Rather, I'd like to amplify the words he's already shared. It's a snapshot in time, and things may have changed for him since writing these words. We're all, regardless of age, changing. The people you see in the media are usually one type of trans person. They're usually binary, identify as either female or male. They usually pass as someone of that gender. They're usually white, and they usually have this narrative that they've always known they were, quote, the wrong gender. It makes other trans people scared to tell their stories. Non-binary people are people who don't identify as male or female all of the time. There are a lot of subsections. You might be agender, gender fluid, bigender, a demigirl, or a demiboy. You might not understand the nuances of all the differences, but everyone is always making up new identities to match their experiences, and that can only be a good thing. While it can be confusing, it's better than saying you can only be this thing and we won't talk about anything else. I just identify as non-binary and don't put myself into any sub-binary. Some days I like to be a woman, and I'm also okay with identifying as being a guy. I'm pretty much nothing at the moment. I came out as a trans guy and transitioned. I took testosterone. I've had top surgery, chest reduction, and then a hysterectomy in 2015. The hormones and surgery is about aligning my body to what it should have been at birth. Being born with the correct parts would have made things easier, but at the same time, I don't want to be told that my body is wrong. It's very difficult to get treatment as a non-binary person. They were dismissive about the fact that I was feminine. Non-binary people are used to it. You are warned when you go in to the gender clinics. If you want treatment, you will have to present as male or female and stick to that story. I don't want to be part of any mainstream pro-trans movement if it doesn't include non-binary people. In terms of celebrity, there needs to be a lot more diversity. It's a circle. People don't come out if they don't see anyone like them. I'm mixed race. My mom is Spanish and Nigerian. I am still finding out how I connect with an identity apart from a Western LGBT identity. That's something I'm still working on. Within the religion indigenous to the Yoruba people, an ethnic group in Nigeria, there are a lot of gender-fluid deities. As a trans person trying to find my roots, that's one part of my heritage I feel positive about.
See if this rings true for you. Someone you know and love gives birth to a baby. If you don't already know, the first thing you probably ask before any other question is, boy or girl? Because, you want to know how to imagine this little being that looks pretty much like every other newborn human, all chubby and squinty and squirmy with some fine hair on top. Do you start to imagine him as a handsome and confident jock, or a nerd into math and comics? Do you start to imagine her as an avid reader, adept at social commentary, or dressed in pink, playing Tea Party and dreaming of her wedding day? There's some overlap between the two extremes of male and female, an area that stereotypically feels a little non-sexual. But generally speaking, because most of us have been trained all our lives to do so, we tend to want to know how to think about this new person, even when they can't express it. At best, we don't want to offend, and we hope to get it right. At worst, we have a very narrow expectation about each of the two genders and how they're supposed to be, and we attribute our beliefs to either God or science. Basically, though, it's not so much about what is in the hearts or minds of these new lives. We make our determinations based on plumbing. We determine how we'll treat somebody based on that plumbing. When we invest too much into who they will be, based on the plumbing between their legs at birth, we deny people, including ourselves and each other, the chance to live authentically, to become who we truly are. Maybe they have the physical characteristics to be labeled male, but the emotional characteristics usually attributed to females, or vice versa. Maybe they're a bit of both, somewhere in between, or neither. Maybe they'll develop into a way of being that fits neatly into some pre-existing non-binary category, or not, in which case they'll have a unique and likely ever-evolving way of making their own kind of sense of who they are. But if we have any expectations of how someone is supposed to be, we deny them the right to figure out who they are on their own. We force them to first deal with our needs. It's like making somebody else carry all your baggage, then unpack it for you while you tell them how you like your t-shirts folded. It's a lot of baggage for all of us to carry because it's been around for more than 2,000 years, going back to the early Greeks, Romans, and Palestinians. We know about their common understanding of that time of gender because of their surviving philosophical rhetoric, as well as public and private documents, everything from contracts to personal letters. Jerome H. Nairi, a Jesuit scholar from Notre Dame, wrote in a research paper called Jesus, Gender, and the Gospel of Matthew that women and men were expected in that time to engage in 3 different kinds of relationships: public, politics, private friendships, and private family. In all 3 cultures, there were strict rules of behavior that were widely accepted in both religious and secular settings for all 3 types of interactions. Now, not all men were expected to be leaders in public life, but those who were expected to address and advise on the ways of interaction and to define the obligations of private life. In other words, leaders were expected to set an example in word and deed, beginning at home, about public mores and private responsibilities regarding everything from work and discipline to taxes and war. Public responsibilities were only given to those men who could prove they managed their private lives well. So it was important that they consistently did what was considered to be the right thing. They got married and practiced fidelity and monogamy. They fathered children whose moral development they controlled. They provided for their daughters by building dowries to ensure that they could marry well. They planned for the distribution of their estates, keeping them intact by giving nearly everything to the eldest son. If a man was the eldest son in his family of origin, he would take responsibility for his elderly parents and his unmarried sisters. And if need be, he would fight in war, even kill anyone who threatened the safety of his community. Because he was responsible for so many people, and his reputation was affected by the behaviors of his dependents, he had the legal right, the duty even, to use whatever violence he thought was necessary to protect the family and his reputation, even to the death. I should point out here that there were a lot of expectations of women too. Publicly, all they could officially do was stay by and support the men, submitting to their will. Privately, they could be very influential, even powerful, if they used enough subterfuge. Officially, the job of women was to promote peace and forgiveness, the so-called feminine qualities intended to nurture kindness and gentility. And if they did the wrong thing by offending a man with power over them, they could be killed. There was one leader in this biblical time more than 2,000 years ago who went against all of the expectations of gender. You don't have to be a biblical scholar or even a believer in the faith he inspired to see how countercultural the character of Jesus of Nazareth was. He didn't marry or have children. He treated his disciples, adult men and women, as his family, almost like his children, expecting his love, affection, and even exasperation. He eschewed wealth in a multitude of ways. You could correctly call him homeless by current standards. He never accumulated riches that we know of, and certainly never managed an estate, not even providing for his widowed mother after his death that he knew was approaching. He trusted that she had the ability to care for herself. Those were all of his private behaviors. The amazing thing is that he rose to prominence without proving his ability to manage a family. Publicly, he respected women and honored their authority, a practice that continued long after his murder and was vexing to the traditionalists. Paul was constantly admonishing fledgling churches to take away the authority of women priests. Jesus told his followers, half-heartedly, to pay their taxes and follow the laws of the Roman colonizers. But the laws he was really upholding were the laws of God. And they weren't the old eye for an eye laws either. They were laws that promoted peace and forgiveness, intended to nurture kindness and gentility. Forgive those who hurt you. Reserve judgment against those who've broken the rules, especially the outcasts, the lepers, prisoners, and sexually transgressive women. Give away whatever would inhibit your spiritual growth. In his Sermon on the Mount, he taught that the meek shall inherit the earth and the peacemakers are the children of God. In every way, Jesus did pretty much the opposite of what was expected of a man. He took the public and private roles of women. So much so you could call him queer, a gender outlaw, non-binary. In a world where the assumption was that men were above women, to take on the roles and values associated with women was seen by many as not so much an elevating of women's status, but as a debasing of himself. That's a big part of why he was such a threat to the status quo. And of course, I'm not the first person to make this point. Former Jesuit priest Robert Goss, in 1993, wrote a book called Jesus Acted Up, a gay and lesbian manifesto. In much longer fashion, he pointed out everything I just shared, and a bit more. Then he took it one step further, saying that Jesus didn't just set out to redefine gender roles, but to obliterate them. According to Goss, Jesus' theology was about liberating the oppressed and afflicted, caring for the needy, and shifting power from the rich to the poor, undoing everything men were supposed to do. Jesus, Goss said, sought to become actively queer through his solidarity with the disenfranchised to the point of manifesting the erotic rather than denouncing it as sinful. Personally, I think it's a bit of a jump from shifting power to manifesting eroticism. But I have to admit this. Seeing Jesus as a gender revolutionary means reading the sacred text completely differently. Not through the lens of conventional history. Not as instructed by the mainstream teachers of the past and present. Not under the weight of current social expectations, but by reading the actual words of the text and understanding their meaning in the context of the times in which they were written. Reading the 2,000-year-old text completely differently requires getting outside of the everyday and seeking a new experience. That's pretty dramatic. It's as dramatic as cows leaving their homes, exploring the forest, and seeing a rodent with a parachute. Reading the text differently is as dramatic as following a little creature up a tree and accepting an invitation to fly with a dragon. March 31st was National Transgender Day of Visibility. And it got me thinking, First of all, I thought it was perfectly appropriate that it fell during Holy Week. That week leading up to the day in which Jesus was killed for his being a gender outlaw, for his transgressions. There's some gender normative people, I'm sure, who feel threatened by something like National Transgender Day of Visibility, as if the very presence of gender non-conforming people is undermining the whole notion of gender, the age-old standards, and also the lives they've lived based on how they experience their own bodies. For a lot of men, the same old ideas that had been around since antiquity can come up. That to be like a woman is to debase himself to her level. For some, the idea that accepting the unfolding stories of transgender people threatens the validity, even the sacredness of two definable, limited, separate, and opposite genders is alive and well in many who live as heirs of the Greek, Roman, and Palestinian cultures in which Jesus lived. Even followers of Jesus and the religion he inspired. And his message is lost on them. I'd like to think that it's only Christian conservatives who deny the validity of the transgender experience. But the truth is that even religious and political liberals, even Unitarian Universalists, can have trouble accepting a truth of human identity that doesn't align with their idea of fixed roles that seem ancient. Every year at our General Assembly, there are people who complain bitterly about gender-neutral restrooms. In our congregations, trans people are repeatedly misgendered, even dead-named. Dead-naming is the practice of calling people by the names they were given at birth, rather than the appropriately gendered names they've chosen for themselves. I know of one congregation in which the parents of a transgender teenager threatened to sue the professional and lay leaders of the congregation if they used the name and pronouns preferred by their 16-year-old child. And just a few years ago, I witnessed one of our congregations almost unanimously affirm that they would not welcome as a minister a man they considered to be effeminate. So obviously, when it comes to rethinking gender roles and allowing people to express it for themselves in healthy, authentic ways, we have some work to do. And that's where something like Transgender Day of Visibility can be helpful. It's a chance to start to understand the past differently, to see the work of Jesus as an agent of social change and as a gender revolutionary. Transgender Day of Visibility is a chance to get outside of the everyday and see a new reality that has existed among us throughout all of human existence, expressing differently in different cultures. To accept people for who they are and respect their choices of name, pronouns, and clothes. To trust their agency and their ability to forge their own future. To allow expansive thinking. Most of all, Transgender Day of Visibility gives us all the chance to become somebody new. Somebody whose identity and self-worth come from our own authenticity and not the strictures of history or the tyranny of the majority. It gives us the chance to not feel threatened by the existence of people whose experiences are different from our own, even among transgender people who identify differently from each other. Transgender Day of Visibility pushes us to become people who actively liberate the oppressed, rather than just witnessing change from a safe distance. It requires us to get beyond our personal relationships to something more expansive. Here's what I mean by that. We tend to see people the way we want them to be, which usually involves making us feel comfortable by affirming our beliefs about the world, humanity, and even our own families as extensions of ourselves. which seems fine until you're faced with someone who appears to be completely different from who they actually are. If we can't see or accept people in their fullness, regardless of conditions that feel like contradictions to us, we're denied the opportunity to enjoy the diversity of creation and humanity. Not accepting people for who they are, denying the gender they claim because it's different from what you expect it to be, is like ignoring the whole world beyond your personal space. It's like denying the existence of lions in Africa because there are cougars in the Americas. A few weeks ago, a friend of mine commented that in the last few years, he's known a lot of people, especially younger people, who've come out as being transgender, genderqueer, or non-binary, using a lot of different labels and descriptors for themselves. He joked that it almost felt like an epidemic. And I get that. We are experiencing a surge of people coming out, but it's not like a virus that's spreading. People are supporting and even emboldening one another to gather the fortitude to do what people have been doing for millennia in cultures like ours, where so much of their identity is forced upon them by the expectations of sex determined at birth. There are a whole lot of people supporting each other and not just accepting what they're supposed to do, but rather being who they're supposed to be. That's a good thing, and my friend knows that. Every time somebody comes out as their authentic self, asking me to change the pronouns I use for them, it's a chance to see them and the world completely anew, to imagine greater possibilities for them, for myself, for the whole universe. I'm often humbled by the vastness of life beyond the space that I can reach within my limbs. If I look closely enough, every day I can learn about some form of life I've never heard about before. Some of them have been there right before me the whole time. I just never took the chance to open my eyes and see them. I hope I, and we, can do a better job at accepting people just the way they are, so we can learn from their gender revolution. May it be so. On Thursday, I was talking with Patrick, the chair of the membership committee, and I realized something. For as long as I've been a minister, when I get to this part of the service, I've always said, if you are visiting us for the first time, please let the collection basket pass you as our guest. Then the pandemic hit, and we couldn't see our guests in the same way, and the whole world felt like it was shrinking, and the federal government was so afraid our financial systems would be destroyed that they started handing out money like drunken sailors. And from that first week of worshiping online, I changed the rhetoric to, if you appreciate the work that we are doing, please give what you can. It's a totally different message. It's more NPR than UU. more consumer-driven than mission-driven. So today I make the radical shift back to the way it used to be. If you make a pledge to this church and you're following through every month, thank you. If you make a pledge and you've let it slip, let me humbly remind you to please send in a check in fulfillment of that pledge. And if you're visiting, please enjoy our offerings as our guests. Even if we can't see you, we are genuinely glad that you are here. Whew. That felt so much better, so much more authentic. I'd like to close our service now with the words of Rev Denis Mishra Marzetti. He wrote, "Everything about our existence points toward change, flexibility, and dynamic recreation. And it's hard because change involves loss. Can we hold the losses well while not holding ourselves back?" And now I say, I think we can. So I leave you with this blessing. May we hold the losses that come with all change while not holding ourselves back.
Ready? We join pause
in Unitarian Universalist Fellowship,
pledging ourselves to an individual religious freedom,
which transcends all creeds.
Not to think alike,
but to journey together